Hello all, it's about a minute until the start time. We will start approximately 2 minutes after the actual start time. So 2 minutes after the actual start time. Just as a reminder to folks that the questions box is available to you for any questions that you may like to post during the session. I'll do my best to answer those questions as we go along throughout the session, but if I can't get to them, then I'll do my best to answer them at the end of the session. So again, it's about a minute until the start time, but we'll start about 2 minutes after. Thank you. So start at 1:02 p.m. Eastern. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of the Defend and Deliver DMARC Bootcamp. Again, my name is Shazad Mirza, and I'm the Director of Operations for Global Cyber Alliance. So as last week, we talked about all the overview of DMARC, and we gave an introduction to everything that will be coming up in these next few weeks. So, just as a reminder in terms of this, so that this week is week 2 in terms of we'll talk about SPF and DKIM, and next week we'll go into more detail with DMARC. So before we get started, just really quickly, just as a reminder that you do have a questions box available to you. Feel free at any point in time to post any questions during the session. I'll do my best to answer questions as I go along, but if I can't get to the question during the session, I'll try my best to answer those at the end of the session. So let's go ahead and get started. So starting off in this week, it's going to be all about SPF and DKIM. But just as a reminder, we're not going to go completely deep dive into SPF and DKIM. We're just going to go as far enough to let you know what you need to be aware of and things you need to know in order to help you get started and get moving to get SPF and DKIM set up and make sure that you have DMARC available as well. So there is a lot more that in-depth approaches to SPF and DKIM that you can go out and learn. Just make sure you go to the DMARC Bootcamp resources site, and those resources are available to you to go into even more deep dive than what we're going to go into right now. But we are going to get into a lot of technical aspects over these next few weeks. So let's go ahead and start off with Sender Policy Framework, so SPF, right? So what does this do for you, right? So SPF is going to be that policy that you need to create that will define that these are the systems that are allowed to send on your behalf, right? So these are the systems that are allowed to use your organization's domain name, right? So remember, what are those going to be? Those are going to be your own mail servers. Those are going to be possibly the third-party mail servers. These could be your third-party vendors that you're using to send mail, right? So it could be like your Constant Contacts, your HubSpot, Salesforce, and so on. Now, remember in terms of how this works with SPF. So SPF checking is actually being done by not using the from address that's in your email header. So what you see displayed in front of you. It actually uses information from the message header, which is going to be envelope from or recipient from. Okay, that's what it's actually going to be used to determine what the sending domain is. So not what's actually being displayed, but what's actually behind the scenes. Now, where are you going to create your SPF policy? So your sender policy framework. This is actually going to be utilizing DNS as well. So it's going to be you're going to be using your public DNS to create this. So that's going to be a TXT record that you're creating on these types of systems. Now, a key thing is that you need to be aware of is when you're creating these SPF records for your domain, you can only have one SPF record per domain. Okay, that does not include subdomains. So if you have subdomains, you can create an SPF for that subdomain, but it's only one per domain. So one per unique domain. So how does SPF actually go through and work? So what you're actually doing is you're publishing an SPF record, right? So you have that record, you publish it into your DNS server. So you as the sending organization. So again, just like I mentioned before with DMARC last week, is that from the user perspective, this is completely transparent, right? So you don't have to install anything or do anything new or anything client side for SPF, right? This is just something you just create the policy in DNS and that's it, right? Because the sending email server is the one that's going to add all that metadata to the header of the email message as it's being sent out, right? It's going to say where it's originating from, right? It'll be the IP, provide the IP address of where the message is originating from. It's going to put in the recipient from or envelope from inside the message header. And then the email gets sent out from there. Now, the receiving email service, what needs to be done on that side is you do need to enable something called SPF verification. Right? Without SPF verification, SPF is not going to be checked. All right, now this is not, we're not talking about DMARC right now. It's assuming there's no DMARC in place right now. All right, so SPF verification has to be enabled in order just to check SPF. If SPF verification is not turned on, then obviously we're not that system's not going to check for SPF. It's going to treat those messages like normal and go through whatever regular filters you may have in place. However, if it does have SPF verification in place, it's going to go back to the originating domain's DNS server and say, all right, I got a message from your domain. Do you have an SPF record? Yes, you do. Okay, this is where this message came from. Is it coming from one of the systems on your authorized list? Right. So depending on how it's set up, if it passes that SPF check, right, it's coming from an authorized location. Right, an authorized domain and authorized location, then it should pass on the email because it's considering it a valid email. That's assuming, again, that other filters are not going to prevent the message from going through, right? Because your other filters will still apply. If it fails your SPF, then at that point, it's going to be considered a failed message, right? So it marks the message as failed, but it doesn't say in SPF what exactly to do with the message. It's just marking it as failed, right? So the receiving side that has SPF verification turned on, they have to make the decision as to what to do with the failed message. So they have to decide, do they put it in the quarantine at the admin level so the admins can review it before it gets released? Do they just send it off to the recipient spam folder? Or do they just completely drop it and ignore the message? So just decisions that the receiving side has to make, right? Because the SPF from the sending organization, when I show you the record, it doesn't define what specifically to the message, to do with the message. It only says to mark it as a failed message or consider it as a failed message. So if we are a subdomain, can we implement these changes if the root domain has not? For example, a subdomain off of nh.gov, if a higher level .gov and nh.gov implemented DMARC, can we? So from the DMARC perspective, you can implement DMARC at the subdomain level. So you can do it even if a higher level or a top level domain has implemented DMARC, you can still apply it at the sub-level domain. But I'll get to more specifics with that. When it comes to SPF though, you do have to have an SPF record for each subdomain that's being used to send mail. So that is required. So now what does the SPF record look like? So you're creating a TXT record in your DNS. There might be an offshoot chance that somewhere along the line, some vendor may say, okay, create a CNAME record. That's fine, but primarily it's your SPF record that's going to, the TXT record that's going to be used. Some service providers, especially in the cloud, they may call it an SPF record as opposed to TXT record. So if they do that, go ahead and use SPF. And really, technically, they're creating a TXT record, but they're calling it SPF just to help people and answer and help people and get to setting up SPF relatively quickly. Now, when you're setting an SPF record, right? So whenever you create any type of DNS record, you have to give the DNS record a name, right? The name can be left blank. So in this situation, that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to leave that name blank. Because what it will do is by leaving it blank, it automatically inherits the domain name. So that basically you're meaning that you're applying this value to this domain name. All right, so it really depends on what type of situation or what case you're in. All right, and next week I'll show you how to create SPF records again in Windows, Bind, and Cloud DNS. So you can see some of the differences, assuming you attend all 3 sessions. But when you do it, you either leave it blank or you can put an @ symbol. It depends on the requirements. But the value is always going to be there, right? You're always going to provide a value, and there's going to be different tags involved when you're creating these values. So before I move, there's a question about, is there a recommendation for DNS TTL values for SPF DKIM? There's no default recommendation, really. Is whatever you put in for your own DNS records, and typically people put in 1 hour. That's fine, right? You can put in 1 hour, especially with DKIM. You don't want to go more than 1 hour, but for SPF, it's fine if you do it an hour. That's what most people tend to stick with. So now those tags and the value. So here there are multiple tags that you have available to you in SPF. The ones that I'm listed here are the ones that you primarily see. Do you have to use them at all? No, it really depends on what you're using. Wait, sorry, I take that back. The only one you do have to use, based on the list here, is V equals SPF1. That is required. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, because that's what's defining that this is the SPF record for this particular domain. The other ones, the next few tags you see, depends on what the situation is and what you're and within your environment, right? So for MX, you may have heard of MX records in DNS, right? Those are the mail records that you create for all the incoming mail servers in your organization, right? Because that's defined so that people know that these are valid mail servers that belong to your organizations, and that these are the ones that are willing that you can accept mail with, right? So so by defining MX and just MX alone, you're basically telling the SPF to say, look at the MX records for these domains and consider those authorized as part of this policy to send on this domain's behalf. Then there's A, right? This is going to be included if there are other systems other than your mail servers. So other ones within your organization that you're going to be using to send mail, right? So you can either use A by itself. So A means that check for the A record. So anything that has an A record for this domain is considered authorized to send mail using this domain, right? But if an A record does not exist, this is not going to be used, right? So you can also put an A:domain. So typically it's the name of the server that you're creating. But again, make sure the A record actually exists. You can also put A: and an IP address as well. That would work as well. Then there's include. Include is only used for external domains. So this is where you're going to use things like Office 365, Google G Suites. You're going to find those by using the include statement, right? So everything at that point, then that's, as long as there's an include statement available, then that's what you're going to be using. And then there's IPv4 and IPv6. These obviously you can use if you have access to the IP addresses of these systems. But you have to be very careful using those. Don't use these for third-party vendors unless they have specifically assigned to you an IP address. Otherwise, only use IPv4 or IPv6 for addresses that you have control over. right? So you can actually use CIDR notation as well with here. You don't have to use just the specific IP. So there's a question is if your record only has V equals SPF, it does not include the 1, it will not work. You need to include the 1. So it has to be V equals SPF 1. So make sure you make that change. So there's a question on that. Another question is if you use Office 365, there's already an SPF TXT record. Do we need to change this SPF TXT record? As long as you only have one SPF record, that's fine. So when you use Office 365, one of the nice things about it, actually, if you connect it to your DNS, it will actually create the record, SPF record for you. But then when you're adding, right, if you have other third-party vendors and you're adding to it, that's the SPF record you modify. Do not create a new one. All right, so if that's the only SPF record, that's great. If you see 2 SPF records, combine them together. There can only be one for that particular domain. Does SPF verification need to be turned on at both sender and receiver end? Yes, it should, because you as a sender are technically a receiver, right? So you should have it for checking everything outside. Same with the receiver, the receiver should have an SPF verification and an SPF record in place. So again, with A and include, so A is primarily meant to be used for your own organization's IPs and domains, not for external, right? Because it's looking for A records. So A records in your DNS. So that means you're controlling it, right? So it has to be something internal to you or within your organization. Include is for external domains, right? So it could be like A:, mail1.globalcyberalliance.org, include : _ spf.salesforce.com, right? Because Salesforce is external. The A:, the mail1.globalcyberalliance.org is internal to our organization, and we have an A record for that, so we're going to include it in that sense. So A is mainly for things within your domain. Include is for anything outside of your domain, so external to your domain. Now, there are other SPF tags as well. These aren't used too often. There's one that you may see, but I'll let you know what that one is. So PTR. So you've heard of pointer records, right? So pointer records in DNS is basically doing a reverse lookup, right? Not too many people have pointer records set up. They tend to, or they have it set up incorrectly. So that's why PTR is not used too often. You do have the option to do that, but it's not used too often. Exists. So exists basically says if there's any valid A record for this domain, that means it's allowed to pass. It's considered a pass. It's allowed. It's on the allow list. So it's just checking for any valid A records in your domain. The benefit of using exists is that way you don't have to keep putting A:, 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 and so on, right? You can just put exists, and that checks for all the A records. You don't have to put the A tag every single time. And there's benefits of that, because that helps reduce the number of domains that you have and the number of domain lookups that you have in your SPF. Redirect. So redirect is basically saying that, look, my SPF, to find my SPF record, I'm going to redirect you to this domain. So go to this domain, and that's where all my SPF information is actually located, and they're authoritative for my SPF. So redirect, when you use the redirect tag, you're using it by itself. You're not going to see the include tags involved, or IPv4. It's just a redirect, because you're pointing them to go somewhere else. EXP. Okay, this is going to define the DS name whose TXT records text may be returned with any failures message. This is not something that's very used. You have to be very careful when you're using this, because it can actually cause problems and cause some issues. But if you do end up needing it, having to use it, it has to be at the end of the policy. Then there's other macro expressions that you can use. I'm not going to go through all of those, because that will we don't have enough time to do it in an hour within this session. It could take longer. There's so many different mechanisms, so many different setups and things like that, that it gets very complicated and it can get very confusing. So, but if you go to the DMARC Bootcamp resources guide, there's a link there that should point you to some sites that have macro expressions where you can learn that if you really want to get into going that deep. Now, the last tag for SPF is the all tag. This all tag is very important. Why? Because this is the tag that is required. So the all tag must be present. So the V equals SPF1 and the all tag have to be present. V equals SPF at start, dash all, or all the all tag at the very end, and everything else that goes in between. Because the all tag is what's going to define how the message is going to fail, and what your requirements are in order for the message to fail. So there's dash all, so hyphen all or dash all. This is basically saying that only the domain's mail servers that are on the on the policy, that includes the A records, the include records, are allowed to send mail for domain. Anything else is prohibited. So if it's not listed or if it's not in this policy, it's considered a fail. So mark that message as a fail. Tilde all, which is soft fail, is basically being a little bit lenient, right? It's basically saying that, okay, even if the server's not on the policy, you can accept the message, but mark it as non-compliant. And this is really, you tend to use the tilde all mainly when you're using third-party providers. I mean, if you look at all the third-party providers, they're going to recommend to use the tilde all. And the reason they end up doing that and telling you that and recommending that is because, you know, maybe an IP address is missing or a domain is missing in their SPF. So, you know, you still want to allow the message to be accepted, but make sure it's marked as non-compliant because it's not compliant with the policy. So question mark all, which you shouldn't really use, basically said there's nothing can be said about the validity of any of these messages. So it's either on the list or it's not. Plus all means that any host can send email for this domain. That should ever be used. It's like going in your firewall and putting in any, right? Any source, any destination, any port, right? There's no point in putting in all those firewall rules ahead of it, right? So don't use the plus all. The only time I've ever seen anyone actually use the plus all was just to make sure that the FPF, that it was an SPF that was causing a problem when in terms of message deliverability. But then again, you're not going to know whether the message is being delivered because, right, this is the last tag. There is no tag that I've defined that says send me a report back. Tell me send a report back to this email. So that way I know what happened to that message or whether that message failed or whatnot, right? Or there's no report to tell me, okay, receiving side, how did you handle those messages, right? Because there's nothing that's in SPF that tells you to do so. So here are examples of SPF records. So these are just a few. So like the first one would be example of what you would use if you're using just Google G Suites. The second one would be an example of what you could be using if you're using Office 365, and maybe if you have a hybrid environment, you could have the MX record, right? The last one is just saying, just giving an example of what IP4 is and putting it in there. Now, if you need more than just, if you have multiple external domains that are being used, you just have to add them in there, right? So like, for example, if we take the first one, V equals SPF1 MX include colon underscore SPF.google.com space include colon underscore SPF.salesforce.com, right? Space include colon, I don't know what the other ones are, like MailChimp.com, you know, whatever they define to put in there. So, but each domain has to have the right tag in front of it. Each IP has to have the right tag in front of it. You're not separating with commas or anything like that. You're just putting in separators, and that's it. Using space to separate between the two. If someone has Office 365, then only MX is enough. This include is not needed, correct? I actually recommend that you do have the include. The reason I say that is because by having the include statement spf.protection.outlook.com, that could potentially include other IP addresses of mail servers that are not in your MX, right? Because in MX, I believe they tell you just to put in something.protection.outlook.com, but that could just be for a set of servers. Having the include statement in there will actually protect you and just cover you just in case Microsoft does something odd. So it's best to do it that way. In the email header, the reply to is the true real sender email address. So yeah, I get the envelope from is actually, yeah, or the recipient from is the true real sender email address. So items that you need for SPF. So when you're getting ready for SPF and setting it up, right? Make sure you have access to your public DNS, so your organizations or whatever domain you own. So whether it be GoDaddy, whether it be a Windows DNS, Bind, HostGator, whatever you use, make sure you have access to it, right? See if you have MX Records. You can do a lookup on that, right? You could do a dig or NS lookup for MX Records, or just ask your DNS admin, hey, are we using MX Records? So that way I know whether I should include the MX tag or not. IP address or domains of systems sending on organization's behalf, right? If you have anyone, so do you need to have the A tag, or do you need to include IPv4, IPv6, right? Talk to your developers. Maybe they have a test system that they need to confirm that they can send mail using the domain name, right? Because if you leave it off SPF, those messages could potentially get blocked. If third-party vendors support SPF, not all third-party vendors support SPF. So you need to check if they do. And if they do, you need to find out what they would like you to add to your SPF record, right? They will tell you, include : and then the domain or what IP or whatever information you need to be added. That is the information they will provide you. So make sure you follow the vendor's SPF instructions. Don't do a lookup of their SPF policy and copy that. Follow the instructions that are provided to you. All right, because they typically, like MailChimp and Salesforce, they have guides in there that are available to you. Use the guides. All right, don't do a DNS lookup of anything like that or anything like that, because I've seen a lot of people do that, and that's a problem and that's an issue. Right? Follow the guides, follow the instructions, and use those and follow that. Now, the other part of this is that when it comes to SPF, I'm going to talk about this a little bit. So there's a part of SPF that is required in terms of DMARC, right? So DMARC requires something called SPF Alignment. So it's not just checking to see if SPF is correct, but it also wants to make sure that SPF Alignment is in place as well. And then what that means is it's making sure that the sending domain, so the actual from, and what is being used for SPF check are actually the same. So what does that mean? So here's an example. So in terms of good SPF alignment, so in order to pass DMARC, you need to make sure that the from address, so the from address, what is visible, info@globalcyberalliance.org, needs to be the same domain as return path at Global Cyber. So if these two match, then DMARC path is considered that this is an SPF aligned, so therefore that's a part, that's would consider it a pass. Now for SPF alone, so SPF verification, what SPF verification does, it just checks the return path. It does not check the from, right? So SPF verification is just gonna check, okay, well the return path is info@globalcyberalliance.org. All right, so we need to check globalcyberalliance.org. So in this case, we're using G Suite, so Google is checking to say, okay, the domain of info@globalcyberalliance designate that this IP address is a permitted sender. All right, so that's all it's checking. So if you look at the second one is considered a DMARC fail. All right, so because SPF is unaligned, right? Because look at the from address, it's still info@globalcyberalliance.org, but the return path is mail58.atl11.rsgsv.net, the MailChimp address, I believe, right? So now these two domains don't match, so therefore it's unaligned. So DMARC considers this a fail. But for SPF, it still passes. Why? Because what is SPF checking? SPF verification is checking the return path. It's checking this rsgsv.net to say, okay, do you have an SPF record? Yeah, you do. Okay, what is this? This is the IP address we got the mail from. Is it a permitted sender? It is. Okay, so therefore SPF passes. So you can see how the from address can be spoofed, but the return path, which is behind the scenes where the actual email is coming from, can pass and get past those SPF verifications of SPF checks. Technically, yeah, the envelope from could be spoofed, but it's not as easy to do. It takes, so it's not something that you see commonly. It's really the from address that you see the most spoofed and all that, because that's easy. It's easier to do. So in order to choose SPF, to have passing SPF alignment when it comes to DMARC, the from header domain must match the domain used to authenticate SPF. This is why you need to follow the directions of third-party vendors. They will provide you instructions. They will tell you this is the SPF you need to implement. Once you implement it, come back to your portal, click authorize, and then we will start using your domain name to send mail. All right, so that's something that you need to do, and that's how you need to go through the process. So when you actually end up looking at DMARC reports, this is something that you will see in terms of the DMARC reports. It will show you the alignment. It will actually give you the details about SPF. It will tell you, okay, this message or these messages came from this SPF domain. This is the SPF domain we saw in the message headers. It tells you whether the SPF passed or failed, and it tells you in terms of the DMARC, did it fail unaligned or was it aligned? So it gives you that information. So what you want is what you see in the image on the right-hand side, right? You want everything to be aligned, everything passing, and everything using your domain name. But that's only, again, if it's possible to do so. That's what you want to do. Shortfalls. So one I've already mentioned before is that recipient servers must decide how to handle the message. So you as a receiving side need to determine, okay, well, if these are failing, what do I do? Do I put them into quarantine and check them later and then release them if they look appropriate? Or do I just let them go to the user spam folder? I just don't even bother with them and just say, you know what, if it's not on your SPF, that's fine, whatever. It's considered a reject. We're dropping it, right? And this is where the concern comes into play, because you could potentially drop a legitimate message, right? Because if they forgot to put an IP address or a domain or set up something incorrectly, you could potentially be dropping legitimate messages from those domains. Now, some of the receiving side, they can, with SPF verification, if they choose to, send back something like a bounce or something like that. But in most cases, again, they don't do that, or they just say, you know what, this is too much of a headache. We're not going to turn on SPF verification. Once implemented, there's no mechanism to determine if the message. So for SPF, there's no way of determining. You're now relying on the receiving side to send you something if they want to or if they choose to, right? If they don't choose to, then that's a problem, obviously. If used alone, right, any other domain using the same hosting provider, what's stopping them from using your domain name? Right, if you're using Office 365, right, because the example I gave you, you just put in include _SPF.protection.outlook.com, right? For G Suites, you put in _SPF.google.com. So if other G Suite users, and that's all you have, what's to prevent them from using your policy? Because they're using the same servers and their domain's allowed to use that server, so why can't they change it? So why can't they use yours? So that becomes, so that's an issue. It's an issue when it comes to those hosting providers. There is a 10 domain lookup limit to SPF. So if it sees more than 10 domains in your SPF, then it's going to stop looking after that 10th domain. So the 11th, 12th, 13th most likely will never get looked up. Right, and that's the way that SPF developers created it. They said that if you have too many domains in there, it could cause a loop, it could cause DDoS type activity. So we're going to put in a 10 domain lookup. And there are workarounds and ways around it. I'll show you on the next slide what those are. Right, but again, also, what is it validating, right? It's not validating who the from address, what people see, because how many people actually look at the envelope from or the recipient from behind the scenes? Not many people do. Right, in fact, probably your normal regular user is not going to look at it. They're going to look at the from address. So if behind the scenes is coming from somewhere else and it's passing, and they think it's coming from this actual person, you've got a problem now. And that's, again, strictly talking about using SPF alone, not using DMARC, not using DKIM or anything. It's just SPF by itself. Now the 10 domain lookup issue. Right, so it is an inherent flaw in SPF because, I mean, people I've spoken to can potentially have more than 10 because they have a lot of different marketing type systems or third-party tools that they're using to send mail. My first recommendation would be try to reduce those. Doesn't make, because a lot of those tools probably do the same exact thing. it'd be probably more cost effective just to try to reduce it down to just a few of them instead of using multiple different types. Another option is you can use SPF flattening, right? This is where you would use the IPv4 and IPv6 tags, right? Because you can use an IP address instead of the domain name. But again, be very careful with this, because if you don't have control over those domain names, or sorry, control over those IP addresses, you've got a problem, right? Because a third party's IP addresses, they can change, right? They can decide to add another one, they can decide to remove one, right? But that causes problems for you then if they decide to do that and you don't have a means or a mechanism to continuously check to see if those IP addresses are changing or modifying, adding, being removed, right? So you have to be careful with this. That's where another option is to use dynamic SPF. There's a capability provided by various DMARC vendors. So what they basically do is they use some of the macros expressions that we talked about, but they also have databases set up that do those continuous checks to see, okay, has anything changed? Has anything changed? Is there a new IP? Is there, did they remove an IP and things like that? So they have built-in systems to constantly do that, those kinds of things. So you can go to these vendors. So I believe Valley Mail and On DMARC are two vendors that I know that actually have this capability already. I think some of the other vendors are probably in process and may have set them up. But I know Valley Mail and On DMARC for sure have this capability. The other thing is you can email stream dedicated subdomains. So if there's subdomains that are specific for different things, like say you do you send an email from I don't know, sales.company.com, right? Then set a separate SPF record for just that domain, right? And then you can create a separate DKIM and DMARC policy just for that domain. So that reduces it from your top level, and because you're just using the specific type of subdomain to send mail. So consider that. So use dedicated subdomains for email in this situation. And that's where it'll help rectify and help reduce the 10 domain lookup. And avoid unnecessary include statements, right? If it's not necessary, if you don't need it, it's not being used, get rid of it, right? There's no reason to keep it in there, right? Especially from external domains. The A ones, that's probably going to be needed, but again, if only as long as that A record exists, then you're fine. Right, so that's the 10 domain lookup. So up next is DKIM. So let me actually go through a few questions really quick to see and make sure. So there's a question about how to check to see if SPF verification is turned on in Office 365. I believe that's enabled by default there. I'll have to probably triple check again, but I haven't seen any mechanism for you to disable it and disable it. So just like a DMARC verification for Office 365, it's turned on by default. But let me double check to that, and I'll try to get back to you. So I believe I answered, if an SPF record includes spfprotection.outlook.com, that doesn't mean anybody using Office 365 could spoof our domain and it would pass SPF. Yes, technically, yes, that is the case. So that's why other things like DKIM and DMARC are some things you need to implement, because it's going to help protect that and prevent that spoofing. So just to repeat that question, so someone asked again, so does SPF verification need to be turned on both sender and receiver end? Yes, it does. Because again, you as an organization are a sender and receiver, right? So you need to turn on SPF verification just because you're always a receiver. So another question is V equals SPF1 MX space A tilde all, is that good enough? That's a good start. Just realize that, if there's other includes or third-party vendors, you've basically left them out. So it's a good start. But if that's all you have, then I would, instead of tilde all, I would say put a hyphen all. All right, so those are the questions I see in terms of SPF. So let's go to DKIM. So domain keys identified mail. So what is this doing? What DKIM is doing is adding a digital signature to all the messages being sent from that domain. Okay, so it's not something that's being done at the user level like PGP is. PGP is strictly user-based, right? So the user adds their PGP signature or does the encryption and whatnot. DKIM is server level. This is being done at the server side. This is something you have to set up on the server side, right? You have to set up your servers or your email gateways to do DKIM signing. So it's something you have to turn on, but you also have to create the DKIM keys in order for this to work. Okay, so when you're creating this, so you have to create, there are multiple parts to it, but one part is that you're going to be creating a record, again, on your DNS, right? And this type of record can either be a TXT or a CNAME record. It depends on what you're utilizing, what you're using for your DKIM signatures and DKIM signing capabilities and DKIM creation capabilities. Now, you can have more than one DKIM record. You're not restricted to one, right? Because if you have multiple vendors, you're going to most likely have a DKIM record for each one of those vendors. Okay, so you can have multiple DKIM records. That is allowed. So it's one per server or one per vendor, one or two. Some vendors actually use two. So what you have to do in order for DKIM to work, right? Because it is key based, right? It has a private key and it has a public key. And how you generate those keys, again, is dependent on what you're using, right? Most external services will actually have the capability built into it to generate the keys for you. Okay, so in some cases, they actually handle the private keys and public keys for you and just tell you to point to this record. So they tell you to create a CNAME record. If you have your own email server or gateways, then you're going to be doing the private key, public key generation using those systems. Right, so when it comes to third-party mail providers and marketing systems, right, in most cases, what they will do, they will either provide you with a public key, and if they provide you a public key, you have to publish it as a TXT record. In other cases, some of these mail providers will actually say, no, point to this domain for your DKIM key. So therefore, you're going to be creating a CNAME record in that case, right? You're creating an alias when you create the CNAME record. So it really depends on who you're using. So this is why it's important when you're working with these third-party mail providers or marketing systems. Again, follow their instructions. Don't go use some external tool to create keys. Follow their instructions. Their instructions will tell you exactly what you need to do. Right? In some cases, they say just email the help desk and they'll provide you with the information. So follow their instructions. Okay? So like for example, like Office 365. Office 365, when it comes to creating DKIM, they actually handle your private keys and your public keys. They tell you just create this CNAME record that points here. So they'll give you the domain that they want you to point to. And they actually, in fact, they have you do two keys. They have you create, two records. Google G Suites, they actually have you do a text record. So when you go through the process, they will actually tell you, this is what you need to create. This is the TXT record you need to create. And here's the information that you're going to put in as the value in your DKIM record. Right? So then that way the private key is typically always held by that mail provider, not provided to the organization. So they're handling it for you. In some cases, the public key they may be handling for you, or they may actually provide it to you, depending on the situation. Now, if you have your own mail servers or email gateways, check to see if they have those capabilities of doing DKIM key generation and DKIM signing. So like Cisco Iron Ports and Mimecast are gateways, right? They have the capability built in to do both. So they'll do all the signing. So any email or messages going through for a specific domain through that system, this is that they will sign it for you, right? They'll generate the key, they'll handle everything for you, put it in the appropriate location, secure it, and then sign all your messages. If you're using a Linux system, right, and you don't have like a gateway in place, some of those mail servers that are on there, like SendMail and so on, they have something called OpenDKIM built into it. It's an open source project. That's what's used to generate the keys, and actually has the DKIM signing capability that's integrated into the mail system. So don't install OpenDKIM separately. Typically, when you install SendMail and these other tools, it installs OpenDKIM for you. You just have to go through the steps and the actions to generate the keys and enable the DKIM signing capability. If you have MX Exchange servers, so physical servers, not online servers, not Exchange in the cloud or Office 365, MX Exchange on-prem servers, they by default don't have DKIM capabilities built in. right? It doesn't have it built in. You have to use a third-party tool. So one example is DKIM Exchange. And there are other ones. DKIM Exchange is the one that I put out there because that's the one that I've seen most widely used. It's open source. It's free to download. It's available on GitHub. That will do both DKIM key generation and DKIM signing. But you do need to install it on each Exchange server. Okay? So if you have multiple Exchange servers, you need to install it on each Exchange server. But again, if you have that gateway, use the gateway. Then you have other options to generate just the keys. So like things like OpenSSL, right? The commands are there on how to generate the private key and public key. So it depends, again, what type of tool, because some gateways may not generate the keys. They may tell you generate the keys and import them in here, and then we'll use it for signing. Okay, so OpenSSL and OpenDKIM are the two options that you can use if you needed to create your own keys. But if you're creating your own keys, make sure the private key is in a secure location, right? So when you do the DKIM signing, they most likely tell you where to put the DKIM key so that way you can access it. But make sure it's in a folder that has restricted access, right? Because it's the private key. You don't want to lose that. DKIM DNS TXT records. So if you're creating it, so CNAME record, I'm not going to give, I don't have an example of it, but a CNAME record is really you're creating the name, which is similar to what you see here. There'll be the name of the record, whether it's TXT or a CNAME. It's always going to have a selector._domain key the domain name, right? So that's where it's always going to have that underscore domain key, regardless of whether it's TXT or a CNAME that you're creating. But the value is going to be different. For TXT, the value is going to be similar to what you see here. You may see a little bit more depending on the type of system that you're using. Like Cisco Iron Ports actually allows more options than just the two that I'm showing here. But I'm not going to go into all of those because each system is different. So I'm not going to waste your time going into each one. But the two key ones that do need to appear are the K and the P tags. So what do all these mean? So in terms of the record name, the selector. So the selector is the name of the record, a unique name that you're going to give to the DKIM key, right? So each DKIM record you have will have a unique selector. What is that selector name? Technically, it can be anything you want. So depending, again, what types of tools you're using. So if you're using like OpenSSL or OpenDKIM, you can create whatever selector name that you want, right? But when you're using third-party vendors, they will define what the selector is. They will tell you what it is, so only use what they give to you. Okay, so if a third-party vendor is telling you that this is the name of the record you're creating for DKIM, that's the name you're going to use. But that will always also include underscore domain key. That is required because underscore domain key is what's defining that this is a DKIM record that's being created. And then the domain may or may not be needed depending on the type of system you're using. In most cases, you don't need it. You can actually leave it out. The K tag is going to define the key algorithm that's being used. So like K equals RSA, for example. So it's one type. Again, it depends on the type of system that you're using. They'll give you the different options in terms of what kind of key algorithm you can use. I think RSA and SHA are the ones that I've seen the most commonly used. Then there's the P tag, and that's give you the actual public key string. So when it generates this, everything's generated, you have your private key. The public key is going to be generated based off the private key, and that's the string that you're going to put after the P equals. Now there's two different key sizes for the public key. There's going to be 1024 or 2048. 1024 tends to be the most common size. The reason for that is because when you use 1024, it fits what most DNS server standard size is for character length of the DNS value, which is 255. If you use 2048, it actually exceeds the 255 character limit on most DNS servers. So some of the newer systems will allow for 2048. That allows for more than 255 characters. If it doesn't, and you want to use 2048, then you can actually break your DNS record. Just make sure you follow the instructions correctly on how to break them, because if you do not do it the correct way, your messages that are signed with DKIM are going to be considered unauthorized or failed. So that's why 1024 tends to be the most commonly used, especially with cloud service providers. They typically provide 1024, allow for 1024. I know like some other ones, I think like Network Solutions does do 2048, but you actually have to send it to them. You have to send it to their help desk, and the help desk can create it. So that's something you may want to try with your providers. If you're using Cloud DNS, say, hey, I have this, I'm trying to put this in, it's not going in, can you do it for me? And typically what I've seen in most cases, they will implement it for you and put it in place for you. Just make sure to tell them the whole thing needs to be implemented. Because I had a situation where I did 2048, they only put half of it. They didn't put the whole thing. So obviously DKIM was failing at that point. So I told them, like, no, you're missing it, and make sure you put the whole string in. Don't break this, you know, if you're breaking it, make sure you put the rest of it in there for me. So just be careful and wary of that. So some items needed for DKIM. So again, just like SPF, you need access to public DNS. You need to make sure you know what your selector name is, right? Remember, because it's gonna be unique to each system. So, you know, make sure you choose a good name for that, and then a name enough to be able to associate it with the appropriate system. But again, third-party vendor, if they provide you that name, that's the name you use. You cannot pick your own. Use the third-party vendor's selector name if they define it. Again, remember, you need to have your capability of generating the DKIM keys and a way to sign. So you need to have your key generator and signing tool. So check if your mail server or your email security gateways have them built in. If they do, use those. So email security gateways, use those, because then you don't have to create it on each and every single internal server, right? And again, if a third-party provider, use theirs. Then check also if those third-party providers support DKIM, because not all of them support the DKIM. But if they do, and I'm being repetitive on purpose, because I've seen people, I've said it multiple times, and people have still put in their own or generated their own. Follow whatever the third-party vendor support tells you to do. That's the DKIM record you need to create, whether it be a TXT record or a CNAME record. They will define it for you. Follow their instructions. Now, when it comes to DMARC, there's also DKIM alignment. Right, so DMARC checks for DKIM alignment as well, just like it did for SPF. So this is where, again, you're making sure that the from matches the domain that's there, right? Because then when by default, I mean, again, the from could be something else, but the DKIM signature could be signed by a different organization, right? So if when DMARC verification happens, it looks at the DKIM signature in the message header and looks for D equals, said, okay, does this domain have it? What's the selector? S equals, so in this case, S equals GCA, that's the selector name. So it's going to go back and look for GCA._domainkey.globalcyberalliance.org and see if a DKIM public key is available. If there is one, that's what it's going to check against, and that's where DMARC verification happens. Sorry, DKIM verification. That's where DKIM verification happens. Too many acronyms. So with DMARC, right, DMARC is going to check this D equals in the domain signature and compare it to the message header domain. As long as those match, then everything is considered aligned in terms of DMARC. Okay, so that's to help prevent those DKIM type spoofing type activity. So this is why, again, another value in terms of having DMARC implemented and DMARC set up. So again, some shortfalls when it comes to DKIM, right? Remember the tags that I talk about. There's nothing there that defines and tells the receiving side what to do if the signature is bad or good, right? Because the receiving side is going to have DKIM verification turned on. If they have DKIM verification turned on, they have to make the decision to what happens if these messages pass or fail these signature checks. So they decide quarantine, let it go through, or reject it. There's also no reporting mechanism, right? Because again, there's no tag that says report back, right? Again, if the reporting side wants to say or send some level of a bounce back or something like that, they could potentially do that. Does not determine if the sender server is allowed to send outgoing mail, right? It's just checking the signature. It's not checking to see is it coming from a valid server for that domain, right? Because that's what SPF does, right? DKIM doesn't do that. But then the other thing is that there's nothing in DKIM to say, well, check SPF, right? And there's nothing in SPF that says to check DKIM, right? There's no option there in the DKIM tags or the SPF tags to check the other one of the others. So there's nothing there. But again, now it's the recipient again to decide this authenticity of the mail being sent. So when they check it, they need to decide how to handle a particular failed message. And this is why DMARC comes into value. So here's another reason that for DMARC, right? Because DMARC is going to check for SPF and DKIM, right? So it's going to resolve most of the issues with SPF and DKIM. It's going to say, okay, as a sending organization, I have a DMARC policy. I have SPF and DKIM in place, so make sure you check both of those from where, depending on where it's coming from. Make sure to check for both and see if they pass or fail. Right now, both SPF and DKIM don't have to pass. One or the other have to pass in order for DMARC to allow this overall message to be passed. So if SPF fails, right? So if it fails alignment and it fails the domain part of it, like the SPF check, that's a fail, and DKIM passes on all accounts, DMARC will still allow that message to be passed. Right, both SPF alignment, SPF checks, DKIM alignment and DKIM checks have to fail in order for DMARC as a DMARC fail. Right, so this is where again you're covering your bases and making sure things. So that way, if SPF is set up incorrectly, at least you have DKIM being checked to make sure that whether it passes or fails. Right, and then again with the hosting providers, right, because now you're saying SPF and DKIM, right? So if SPF isn't working correctly, or SPF is a hosting provider, the DKIM is what's unique to your domain, right? The DKIM thing is unique to your domain, so check them both. So that's why if the hosting provider or third-party provider has both SPF and DKIM, put them both in. Use both of them. Don't just use one or the other. Utilize both. We recommend that you use both if that provider has that capability. Then the DMARC reports, right? DKIM and SPF don't provide that report back to you. The DMARC reports, I showed you examples. The DMARC reports includes all that information, right? It tells you for SPF what domain is being used, if it passes or fails, and if it fails or passes to DMARC checks. Same with DKIM. Tells you the domain used for DKIM. It tells you whether DKIM checks passed or failed, and it tells you about DMARC. It gives you all that information. That's why those DMARC reports are very important to get and to review. Right, and then you as the sender created a DMARC policy. Now with that DMARC policy, you're defining the compliance. How do you handle those messages if they fail? So the receiving side doesn't have to determine it. They check your policy and say, okay, this message failed. What do I do with this message? Your DMARC policy says quarantine. Okay, it's going to go into the spam junk folder. Your policy says reject. Okay, I'm not even sending the message on. We're dropping the message. Right, so there's where you see the value in having that have DMARC in place, because it uses the benefits of SPF and DKIM. Granted, it has some of the flaws like the 10 domain lookup of SPF, but overall the benefit is there when you're implementing DMARC alongside with SPF and DKIM. So I'm gonna get to the questions, but just quickly, just to wrap up. So just a reminder, there are bootcamp resources available to you. So in case you didn't get the email, so it's community@globalcyberalliance.org. That's a forum where you can post questions. So in case you have questions that you're thinking of and you want to put it out to the broader community, you're welcome to do so. I mean, you can obviously still email me directly, but again, good chances if you're asking the question, there's probably a lot of other people in the community that have the same exact question. Then there's also the bootcamp resource page. So when you go to that site, that's where the recording is going to be put up. So the recording, typically we try to get up by the end of the week. Unless we have some difficulties, but we try to get up before the end of the week. Same with the slide deck for the following week. We try to get the slide deck up on that site by Friday or the Monday prior to the next session. So that way you have the slide deck, you can download it, and you can make notes if you need to do it. And again, those slide decks are in English, French, and Spanish. So that's where you're going to find those, and other resources available as well there. So other resources about SPF and DKIM are going to be linked off of that page. The next session is next week. So remember, there's 3 sessions next week. You do not need to attend all 3. Just attend the session that is applicable to your organization, right? So if your organization is running Windows DNS, attend the September 29th session. If you're running a bind server, a Linux system, attend the September 30th session. If you're using Cloud DNS. So specifically, I'm going to actually be using Google Cloud DNS and Ionis 1&1 just as examples, but they're similar to what GoDaddy and Cloudflare and some of these other vendors do. So that's October 1st. So the first half, I'm going to talk about the DMARC technical detail. So I'm going to take the DMARC policy and break it apart. I'm going to talk about each of the tags that are involved in the DMARC policy so that we have a better understanding what each of those tags mean, which ones are required, which ones are not required. And then the last half is when I do the demo. So if you want to attend all three, you're welcome to do so. Just the first half is going to be the same exact thing for each 3 sessions. It's the last half that's going to be different. So just giving you guys a warning if you decide to attend all 3. So when are these sessions? Yes, right? So depending on, there's a morning session and there's the afternoon session. So there's an 8 a.m. Eastern session and there's an 1 p.m. Eastern session. So if you register for both, just do whichever one's the best time for you. So we have a morning session and an afternoon session in terms of Eastern Standard Time. So 8 a.m. Eastern and 1 p.m. Eastern are the 2 times. But again, if you registered for the first session, you'll register for all of them automatically. You will get an email a day prior and an hour prior to the session with the link to join the session. So you don't have to register again. On October 9th at 11 a.m. Eastern, we're going to have a session about BIMI. So much more detailed session about BIMI. So Seth Blank, who is the VP of Standards and New Technologies from Valuemail and the chair of the Auth Indicators Working Group who developed BIMI, he's going to be presenting and giving more detail and in depth about BIMI. So what it is, what the purpose of it, how to get started with BIMI. So that's going to be just a session just on BIMI. It's not required for DMARC Bootcamp or anything like that. It's just an extra session. If you choose to attend it, you can attend it if you'd like to. We'll be sharing those links as soon as we get the registration links up and running. So we'll share that. So be on the lookout for that on email and also on GCA social media. So at this point, I'm going to go through the questions. I know it's 2:01 p.m. Eastern, so we're 1 minute over. I'm going to go through the questions that are remaining and do my best to answer all these questions. So if you'd like to stay longer, please feel free to do so. If not, you could always listen to the recording afterwards, because I'm not going to stop the recording until I've answered as many questions as I can. So, but thank you for joining and hope to see you on one of the next sessions next week. So do you have to run DKIM Exchange on OWA server? So if you're using Office 365, then no, you do not need DKIM Exchange. Office 365 has built-in DKIM capabilities. Just follow the instructions that are doing there. If you're using an Exchange server, an on-prem Exchange server, then yes, you will need to run DKIM Exchange. So we have an Exchange on-prem, but we use a Proofpoint gateway. Can we use Proofpoint and not have to run DKIM Exchange? I don't recall if Proofpoint has DKIM signing and DKIM key generation. If it does, then yes, you can just use Proofpoint. However, if it does not, then you'll have to use DKIM Exchange on the on-prem servers. So will DKIM Exchange install an agent to sign the outgoing email, or is another tool necessary? Does Microsoft support installing DKIM Exchange on Exchange Server if any problems arise? All right, so with this question here, so DKIM Exchange does not install an agent on the client side. So it installs it on this email server itself. So basically when you install DKIM Exchange on the Exchange server, you've just installed everything that it needs for DKIM signing and for the domain key generation on there. So there's no other tool that's necessary. Does Microsoft support it? No, because this is a third-party tool, right? So a third-party developed this as an open source tool. They're the ones who created this. So they have support emails. If there's a problem arise, you can always contact them. So it's not something that Microsoft created or put together. So yeah, SPF per unique domain doesn't include something. That's correct. It doesn't include sub. So you can create an SPF per unique domain. So if you have subdomains that send mail, create an SPF record for that subdomain. So do we have to have all three? So meaning, do you have to have SPF, DKIM, and DMARC? So can we use just SPF and skip DKIM? Yeah, you could do that. Problem is you're going to find that if for some reason if something's wrong with your SPF, then those messages are going to be considered failed by DMARC. DKIM and having both DKIM and SPF is just like a check. It's to make sure so as long as SPF passes, DKIM fails, you're still fine. If SPF fails and DKIM still passes, you're still fine. So it's more of a check to have both, and that's why we recommend to have both if you can. But if you can't, it shouldn't stop you from implementing DMARC at a reject level. You can have just SPF by itself or DKIM by itself. But again, if that third party has both, do both. Don't just do one. Quarterly refresh of the DKIM keys. So the recommendation there is, even from the RFC, they say 30, 60, or 90 days. My recommendation typically is if you're using private key, public key within your own organization, your DKIM key should follow whatever your organization's policy is on that. So if you have your policy says to refresh your private public keys on a quarterly basis, then you should do the same thing with DKIM. If it's on an annual basis, then it should be the same thing with DKIM. That way you're just keeping consistent and you're not worrying about, did I do this one or did I not do this one yet? DMARC policy can be inherited by subdomain. Yes, it can be. And I will go into more detail on that next week. Okay, so there's a question about rough percentage of servers that are using verification of each type. So there's nothing that actually confirms the actual usage of verification. Typically, the assumption is if they have an SPF policy in place, they're most likely using SPF verification. And I know for SPF, the numbers are quite high. I don't have the percentages in front of me. But I think on a global level, I think the number is probably somewhere around 60%, I think. Don't quote me on that. But just to, but there are there's plenty of reports out there that can tell you, but it's more about the policy side. There's no way to really confirm whether people are using verification or not. So those are all the questions that I see up here. So I thank you for those that stayed a little bit extra for me to answer some of these questions. But again, I hope this was helpful for you, and I hope again to see everybody on the next session next week. So again, remember, only attend the session that is relevant to your organization. If you want to attend all three, that's perfectly fine. You're more than welcome. You just be hearing the same thing over and over again in all three sessions on the first half. So again, you are automatically registered for all three sessions. Just you can ignore the other ones if you don't want to join the other ones. So here's another question that came up really quick. So the DKIM header can be attached at the Exchange server even if it is behind a gateway. So if the gateway is doing the signing, so as soon as the message leaves the Exchange server and hits the gateway, that's when the DKIM signature is getting added, right? So the DKIM signature will get added at the gateway level, not at the Exchange server, right? That's assuming your gateway is doing the signing. If your gateway is not doing the signing and your Exchange server is the one doing the signing, then yeah, you can have the DKIM header can be attached at the Exchange server even though it's behind the gateway, right? Because it's not, the DKIM signing is looking at the domain aspect of it, right? It's not looking at the IP address of where it came from. It's looking at just at the domain of where the signature is coming from. SPF, on the other hand, could cause a problem, right? But when you do SPF, that's why when you're creating the SPF, you want to make sure with SPF, you use the gateway is in your SPF, not your internal Exchange servers. Unless your external Exchange servers have IP addresses, external IP addresses. Typically, the gateways, the way is your IP address. So it's more SPF you have to worry about than DKIM when it comes to Exchange servers behind a gateway. All right, so that is the last question. We are 8 minutes over. Again, thank you everyone for your time. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I will see you next week on whichever session you select to join. Thank you, everyone.